Bob Lawson, good to have you back on the show.
Hey, Matt, good to be here.
Or should I call you Dr. Bob Lawson?
You should always call me Doctor.
Or just Dr. Bob?
Dr. Bob.
So we planned on having this conversation. I feel like we even talked about this like a year ago when we were drinking beer and talking about the sort of data intersection between beer and freedom, or socialism and bad beer. But there was like a anecdotal truth to that. Having tried to do the Beer Freedom Index, I don't think I can do it with the rigor that you do it in your professional career. But I definitely want to talk about your primary project, the Economic Freedom Index of the World, which you've been doing for how many years now?
I started working on it in 1990, so 30 years.
Yeah.
I was a graduate. I was 12 years old. I was a graduate student. My whole career has been working on this doggone index.
And it was you and Dr. Gwartney.
Yeah, Jim Gwartney was a professor of mine at Florida State, and he went off to some conference, and it was great for me because he was gone for a week and didn't bother me. He was my boss.
Yeah.
And he came back and he said, "I just met Milton Friedman." I'm like, "Oh, that's really cool, man." And he says, "Guess what? We're going to do an economic freedom index." I'm like, "What? There's no internet. This is 1990." So we're digging in the bowels of the Florida State Library trying to find data. And we cobbled an index together, and one thing led to another. 30 years later, I'm still doing it. So.
Yeah. Did you have any idea of how difficult this actually is to measure things in an objective way?
It's brutal, yeah. Like our first index, I think we had 11 variables in 70 countries. Now we have 40 variables in 160 countries or something. So, but yeah, at first, it was just like, how do you measure freedom? It's just this amorphous, vague thing. And so it turned out to be a lot more difficult. Well, it was as difficult as we thought it was going to be. We knew there was a reason no one had done one before. Yeah, because it's really hard. So we gave it the old college try, but we that was precisely right. We just said, every measurement tool ever created is faulty. The thermometer in this room isn't a precise reading of the temperature, but it's good enough.
Yeah.
So good enough was our goal. We want to do an economic freedom index that's just good enough.
So are you suggesting that this was actually Milton Friedman's idea?
Yeah, actually it was.
Oh, that's cool.
Milton Friedman and Michael Walker, who was the founder of something called the Fraser Institute in Canada.
Yeah.
They decided that someone should do an economic freedom index. So they held a conference. They invited Jim. And Jim said, "Well, I'll do it." And of course, when Jim says "I'll do it," what he meant is, "I will do it."
This is what trickle-down economics actually means.
Precisely what it is. Yeah. So I remember him clearly because he came to my office. This is, graduate school is a little hierarchical.
Yeah.
Usually you got called to their offices, but Jim came to my office, which was that's an important day. So he was really excited about the project, and he's still working on it with me.
So I watched a talk that you gave on this, and ultimately you're looking at a set of criteria that we'll go through, but you're basically comparing Adam Smith's idea of natural liberty with Marx's idea of socialism, communism, whatever you want to call that. Talk about that difference, because before there was this word capitalism, there was Adam Smith, and he had a very different conception of what that was.
Yeah, Smith didn't use the word capitalism. In fact, Marx was one that really popularized that term. Smith called it a system of natural liberty, and today we would use other words normally, but he meant private property, markets, competitive markets. He was a big opponent of monopolies. In his day, monopolies were usually granted by the king. The king would say, "Hey, you're the only guy that can sell shoes or something. You'd be the Royal Charter Shoe Company." And he was very much opposed to monopolies. He wanted to see free and open and unfettered markets. He had this crazy idea that you should trade with the French. England and France had bitter wars for centuries. And this crazy Scotsman is up there writing books saying, "Hey, we should trade with those guys."
That's a tougher sell than us trading with China right now.
In many ways, actually. We haven't had any hot wars with China in my memory. And so Korea, yes. But, so yes, Smith had this audacious argument in his era. Many of the ideas are still pretty crazy. A lot of people still think the idea of free trade is a nutso idea. But that was Smith's idea, set of ideas. The question is, how do you put a number on it? That was our goal. Our goal was to try to put a number, 7, 6, 8. There are a lot of dimensions to the problem, so you got to get a lot of numbers and sort of average them all up and stuff. So, but that was the goal, was to try to put a number on how Adam Smithy a country is. We call it economic freedom now. I think it's the best term in today's lingo to use. I don't want to use the word capitalism. It carries a lot of baggage. I think economic freedom is a really good descriptor for what we're talking about. Your freedom to buy, sell, hire, fire, import, export, go about your economic life without much interference.
Yeah. The criteria for that, and this is relevant today because we're still having this argument about, and unfortunately we're saddled with this word capitalism, and I think it does have tremendous baggage, and freedom isn't really about capital accumulation. It's about choosing for yourself, which is a different thing. And one of the side effects of that is the ability to accumulate capital and invest. And those are good things, but this isn't about capital accumulation per se. But we're having this debate, this never-ending debate. It's the same debate that Adam Smith had about, socialism versus capitalism. And Bernie still points to Scandinavia as what he really means by that. I'm not sure he's always said that. It used to be when he was honeymooning in the Soviet Union that was actually a cool thing. But
right. He's
like, nah, I don't mean that anymore. But so, why should people care about where their country is ranked? Does this matter in human terms?
Well, I mean, as a researcher, as an academic, what I really think we can do with this index is help settle that debate. Because, just as sure as you are about Adam Smith being right, and I'm sure Adam Smith is right too.
Yeah.
Just as sure as we are about Adam Smith being right, people like Bernie Sanders are pretty sure Marx is right. And we've been butting heads on this for 150 years, and we're not really convincing the Bernie Sanderses of the world that Adam Smith is right, and they're not doing a very good job of convincing me that Marx is right. So rather than just keep butting heads and sometimes yelling and screaming at each other.
Yeah, we're just yelling past each other.
I am hoping that maybe if we just throw some numbers on the table, hey guys, can we stop pointing at each other and calling each other commies or pinkos or capitalist pigs or whatever? Can we stop the name calling for just 45 seconds and look at this chart?
Yeah.
Because the chart shows Adam Smith is right. I mean, that's the punchline at the end of the day is now that we have an economic freedom index, now that I know countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, even the United States are more economically free, and countries like Congo, Venezuela are less economically free. And guess what? When you look at countries at the top of our list, the Adam Smith type countries, boy, they look pretty good.
Yeah.
And that should, at least if you're an honest Marxist, that should give you some pause. You should have to slow down and say, wait, maybe I got to think harder. Maybe that Marx thing isn't as good as I thought it was, because it certainly doesn't correlate with a lot of really good outcomes.
And by the way, if you don't care about economics and you care about human beings, there is a direct correlation in your data between economic freedom, prosperity, and health and lifespan. How long do you live? How well do you live? These are questions that should matter regardless of your ideology or how you voted in the last election. I hope. If we don't agree on that, then we really don't have a debate, because this is ultimately about individual humans and their ability to thrive.
Well, that's why I said honest Marxist, because I think if you are an honest Marxist, you should care about human flourishing. Marx, at his core, was a materialist. He wanted to see people live better material lives. He wanted their condition on this planet to be better. And he thought socialism, then communism and all that would deliver those goods.
Yeah.
So if you're an honest Marxist and you still want to see human beings live better on this planet, then the kind of data that we're talking about, life expectancy, health data, all of that should be the stuff you care about.
Yeah. And this data it's a different critique than the wall we run into when we're debating so-called democratic socialism with the new socialists who when you point to Venezuela, you point to the Soviet Union, you point to North Korea, they're like, that's not real socialism. Yeah. We want it to be democratic. We want it to be bottom up, I guess. I don't know if they would use that phrase, but
no, they do. They call it bottom up, or socialism from below is one of the terms of art you sometimes hear.
And to me, that's a bit of a contradiction, but we're not saying that in this case, when we try to refute that, we're like, it always turns out the same. It always centralizes power. It always gets into the hands of the wrong people, and it always goes wrong. And every time we've tried it, it's gone that way. This is a set of institutions and policies that are contrary to the socialist agenda, the opposite, every single one of them, that has nothing to do with questions about political power. And like, if Stalin wasn't such a bad guy, it wouldn't have gone that way,
Right.
kind of thing. It's like you say, it's an attempt to be objective and use data. And I should point out, I think it's true that almost all of your data is government data.
Oh yeah, I mean most of it. I mean or quasi-government, World Bank, IMF.
Yeah.
Which it wouldn't exist without governments. We do get some private data. PricewaterhouseCoopers gives us some tax data because they have clients that care about income taxes, so they have this great tax database. And then the World Economic Forum, which is sort of a big NGO. They're private nominally, but they're nonprofit. So we do get some,
but not like crazy libertarian or conservative sources.
Most of the data we're talking about tariff rates. We get them from the World Trade Organization.
Yeah.
Again. So yeah, we're dealing with these normal data. I mean, anybody. If I'm being honest, I tell people like anyone could do my job. Just go out and get the same data I get, put it in your computer, and turn the crank, and you'll have an economic freedom index of your own. I'm not making any data up at all.
Yeah.
So it is kind of funny though. We're using sort of socialist organizations as the providers of our data. But that's data is kind of a socialist enterprise. I mean, there is some private data collection in agencies out there, but most of it is governments. Yeah.
So let's talk about the criteria that you use. Like what are the benchmarks that you compare apples to apples if you go across all these countries?
Well, I don't think we have enough time, but let me give you the big picture.
Yeah, the top line ones.
There's basically 5 areas of the index, and to do well, to be sort of what would Adam Smith do version of the data. The first area is how big is the government? And I mean in a tax and spend sense, like how much money are they taking from people and then spending or borrowing if they borrow the money. But how big is the government in that fiscal sense? That's 1/5 of the index. Countries like Sweden score very poorly because they have, I think, the highest taxes in the world, highest government spending in the world. And then on down. So the Adam Smith, he wrote a whole chapter in The Wealth of Nations. You probably read it when you were in grad school. You probably read it when you were in high school. What am I kidding?
This is why I couldn't get dates in high school.
Exactly. So he wrote a whole book, and Adam Smith did not have a lot good to say about what the government should do. I mean, the government should like build roads and bridges, maybe some schools. Oh yeah, cops and judges, and maybe
keep the French out.
Yeah, keep the French from invading. But other than that, he didn't have daycare centers on his list. He didn't have a Food and Drug Administration on his list. There was just the things that we do. I mean, our government's an order of magnitude larger than what Adam Smith wanted it to do.
Did Adam Smith anticipate mask mandates?
I'm pretty sure he didn't. That's a good question. I don't remember anything about infectious diseases in The Wealth of Nations.
No.
He was a polymath. I'll bet you he wrote about it somewhere, though. So that 1/5 of the index is just how big is the government, and the next part is the property rights part, and it's basically how secure are you in your property, and it could be your real property, like your real estate. One of the key property rights about owning real estate is the ability to sell it. So one of the variables is how easy or cumbersome does the government make it for me to sell you my property? There are a lot of government rules. If you ever bought a house or land, and so there's indexes out there measuring how streamlined that process is. But there's also things like just how many days does it take to settle a contract dispute? So if I pay you money and you don't do a job and I sue you, how long is it going to take the government court to settle that? So that's 1/5 is basically property rights. It's more or less how good the legal system works in settling disputes, handling transactions. The third area is money. It's basically inflation. It's about how safe is your bank account from inflation, basically. Governments control the money supply. The Federal Reserve in the United States, the Bank of England controls it there. And so they have the ability, if they print too much of that money, they can just devastate your savings. That's never really happened in a bad way in the United States, but if you are Argentinian, you know exactly what it's happened several times in your lifetime already.
Yeah.
Our government of Argentina just decides to print gobsmack billions and trillions of pesos, and next thing you know, the pesos you saved were worthless.
And by the way, that's a very insidious tax on working people.
It's
incredible.
It's the most regressive tax in many ways. It also devastates credit markets. I mean, every building, every business that's ever been built was built with borrowed money. And if you don't have a functioning capital market, you will not have a good economy. And you can't have a functioning capital market if people are afraid of the value of money in the future. And that's what inflation means. So that's the third area. The fourth area is trade. Like, can I buy and sell with foreigners? Import. And so we tariff rates from the World Trade Organization. We have some measures of quotas, things like that, capital controls, kind of boring, mind-numbingly boring sets of data, how many capital controls there are.
It strikes me for all of the protectionist rhetoric, and every politician in almost every country in the world has that there is generally free trade in the world. Is that fair? Or
well, it's certainly trending in the right direction. I mean, one of the things that's happened in the last 30, 40 years is one of the biggest trends is a movement towards more trade liberalization, more open trade. And we see it in our data. I mean, those numbers have really gotten better. The World Trade Organization has played a big role in convincing countries to lower their tariff rates. And no country wants to do it on their own, but sometimes you get this sort of, well, we'll lower our tariffs if you lower your tariff kind of deals.
Yeah.
That's really hard to get done, especially when you're dealing with hundreds of countries. But it's actually happened very successfully. So those numbers have gotten better. Still a long way to go, to be fair. The United States actually scores upper middle, but we're by no means are we an example of a highly free trade country.
Yeah, it seems like there's been some, certainly politically, there's backsliding, and it definitely upsets my Republican friends when I point out that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in many ways have exactly the same worldview when it comes to trade. It's a zero-sum game, if they win, you lose kind of thing. And it's if you took the rhetoric from either one of those guys and didn't ascribe it, you could guess either one. It's the same thing.
Precisely on trade. And, the both parties tend to align on trade. So in the era when everyone was a free trader, so the Democrats were free traders, the Republicans were free traders. Clinton was a pretty decent free trader, as was Reagan. But they're kind of going with the wins of voters and stuff. So right now, neither party is particularly friendly to free trade. And the numbers are regressing a little bit, although the big trend is still a positive trend, towards more liberalization. I want
to get back. I'm going to go off on a tangent here just for a second. I want to get back to COVID lockdowns and the impact that might have in future data. But one of the interesting points of lockdowns is that it has been an opportunity to restrict trade and migration in a way that was not possible before COVID was this massive threat. And a lot of the protectionists in the United States were early on advocating that President Trump locked down far more than he did. So it's probably opportunism, but I suspect that will have a real impact on economic performance.
Well, I mean, in a very tangible way, I'm thinking of variables that I use and collect that I know are going to be impacted by this. I mean, one of our variables is at the ports, is how long does it take to get a container through the ports, through customs? And we know, anecdotally we know, and I'm pretty sure the data are going to show that in a year or two when they come out, that process has gotten a lot more cumbersome, in part because of COVID, but just people are home. There's fewer people at the docks. Things just take longer. And that's like a tax. Yeah. It's like a tax on all those goods that come across the port if you slow them down. The other one is we have a variable on travel visas. And needless to say, when you lock down the country, so we captured those data about midpoint in the year. So it was more or less the height of the crisis, though. And although maybe we're at a new height again, I don't know. But we captured all the countries in the world and what countries they had prevented travel from. And so that variable, which isn't a huge variable in the index, but that variable is going to get crushed.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. number gets pretty bad to begin with, frankly, because we have a lot of visa requirements to start with. But we flat out shut down, dozens of countries, and other European countries shut down, like almost everywhere. So they're gonna get rated, like on a 10-point rating scale that we use, they're gonna get scores that were 8s that are gonna be 2s.
Yeah.
And that's good for them. They should. I mean, you know what? Maybe it's a good. By the way, my mantra on this is that maybe it's a good policy. Maybe it's a good public health policy to stop people from traveling. Fine. That's a separate argument whether it's a good policy or not. But it is absolutely a restriction on your freedom.
Yeah.
They're taking away your freedom to move. Maybe it's for a good reason. Maybe it's for a bad reason. I don't care about the good reason or the bad reason. I just care about the measuring of freedom part.
With undebatable negative economic implications.
Probably. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah.
I mean, but it might be worth. I mean, so someone who might be an advocate of lockdowns could say, well, it's still worth it. Well, okay, fine. That's a separate argument. My job isn't to normatively argue in favor of more freedom or less freedom. My job really as a scholar is just to measure it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we know each other well enough to know that I'm also an advocate for freedom, but the science part of it is just measuring it.
Yeah. So free trade.
The last one is regulation.
Yeah.
So how many days does it take to start a business? Hong Kong, it takes 1 day. I don't think it's as bad now, but
is that still true?
It's still true. Yeah. I remember Egypt. I think it took 300 days once or something. No, it was longer than that. It was 3,000 days. It was like several years.
Yeah.
To start a business, and 42. They count the number of procedures, number of permissions you have to get to start a business, and it's a real simple business. We're not talking about an airport or something. We're just like a regular.
I
business.
feel like it was 6 years or something.
It
insane
was.
Like
it was
that.
insane. Now it's not as bad now because when this report came out, everybody freaked out, and most countries have tried to fix that. But so yeah, we have how many days? Like that's a huge freedom. My ability to start a business. Without a lot of interference from the government, and certainly 42 permissions that take years to comply is pretty onerous. That's much more important than taxation. One of the things I've learned is that taxation is a really big infringement. When the government takes money out of my pocket on April 15th, that's a big infringement on my freedom. But for most people in most of the world, that's not the kind of infringement that matters to them. It's the regulator who shows up at your store and says, "Oh, well, the color of your windows is too dark, or that step is not the right size, or you don't have the right kitchen equipment," and all of that. And reality, half the time, that's just a shakedown for a bribe, which is another type of tax. So, but most people in the
less
world,
predictable.
Yeah, most people in the world, it's not taxes that they lose sleep about. Now, if you're a Swede or an American, you probably do worry about taxes, but your typical person in Congo isn't worried about his tax bill as much as he's worried about the regulatory state coming after his freedom.
Well, a lot of that activity that wouldn't be affected is sort of black market activity. In a lot of these countries we're talking about, at the lower end, they're all black and gray markets where taxes don't matter because they just go around.
That's right. And the reason they're black and gray markets so much is because you can't be legal.
Yeah.
Like you don't have a legal title to your farm. So, if you want to sell it to someone, you just work out a deal on the side. That has all kinds of problems, as you know, because you can't enforce it in court and you can't borrow against it, all these problems. So, but black and gray markets are a result of the over-regulation that people face. They say, I can't like no one in Egypt actually went through those 42 procedures. That was the legal procedures, 42 procedures, years and years. No one ever did that.
Yeah.
Either bribed your way through it or just open your business illegally and hope and pray you don't get caught.
The spark to the Arab Spring was a regulatory shakedown where a cop was shaking down a local vendor who ended up, they took everything he had and he ended up setting himself on fire over it.
Yeah.
But it's like people, I think, in the United States, we argue about taxes so much. We sort of take for granted the predictability of the rule of law.
Yeah.
Regulatory stuff is less predictable in the United States, but probably relative to the rest of the world is pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to open a business, the procedures. You got to go to the county courthouse and do this or do that. If you want to sell some property, there's, you hire a real estate expert and they handle the process for you. It's a pain in the neck, and it is like a tax, but it's pretty known and knowable. You don't get now. It's getting worse. I think if you talk to business people in the United States, they will say that there is now more uncertainty. Like you never know when a new inspector is going to come and say exactly the opposite of what the last inspector said, which is the worst of all worlds. Really, is not knowing what the rules are, and that's becoming more of a problem. I think, at least anecdotally, you hear that, and we see it in the data a little bit too.
So I'm watching, and you may need a category for the arbitrary dictates under COVID, because there's a bar owner in New York that just got hauled off to jail because they keep changing the rules, and not just little rules like whether or not you get to be open kind of rules, and the arbitrariness, and like there doesn't seem to be much constitutional constraint on this kind of behavior at the city level, the state level. Eventually, maybe the courts are going to catch up. They've been throwing some of these things out, but it already happens. And I don't know how you measure that, because it throws all that other stuff out the window.
Yeah, and you know, we've seen massive breakdowns in the rule of law. I mean, I've seen it. You've seen it. Restaurants and bars is a great example where, well, are you a restaurant or a bar? Well, we serve alcohol and we serve food. Well, you know, for periods of time, they were shutting down bars, but letting restaurants stay open. So all of a sudden, bars were becoming restaurants.
Yeah.
But really, they weren't. So what that meant was we were not following the rules now. All of a sudden, the city permit people were giving bars restaurant licenses.
Yeah.
And I was approved. I want to go to the bar. So that's great. Fine. Happy with that. But from a rule of law point of view, that means that some people got them and some people didn't get them. Mm-hmm. You know, so we get unevenness in the application of those rules. And that's precisely what we, in the Economic Freedom Index, it's precisely the kind of breakdown in the rule of law that we would penalize you for. I'm hoping that if our data are doing what we think they're doing, we should see it in 2 years. You might want to mention that we're always 2 years behind.
Yeah. Well, when we get into the rankings, I want to point out that this data is essentially from 2018.
Yeah, that's right. Our latest data are 2 years old.
But one more COVID sidebar. I was in Austin a couple weeks ago and driving past this bar that had a big banner out front. We are a restaurant now.
Right.
And I thought about it yesterday because the mayor of Austin, I hope I don't butcher this story because I'm doing it off memory, the mayor of Austin was caught issuing a new stay-at-home no matter what order, which he filmed from a beach house in Cabo. That's awesome.
That's just beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, like there's some sort of let them eat cake or not drink a beer sort of metaphor there.
But reclassifying these bars as restaurants is really quite a sham. I mean,
yeah.
The bar I go to, I will not name it, after they reopened as a restaurant, I asked my bartender, so what was your food? He says, well, it's 5%. We were 95% alcohol and 5% food. And that was after pushing food because they want to try to make themselves a restaurant. So they were pushing the food hard, and it was still 95.5. So it was a sham.
Yeah.
Again, I was happy to see my bar open again and see my bartenders and my friends. But that's not really what the rule of law is about. It's about setting up a rule, a regulatory rule, and then having it applied evenly and fairly. And unfortunately, when the rules get disconnected, though, from what we think is just, people break the rules.
Yeah.
And so the rule of law breaks down when the rules themselves are not just.
It's probably a lagging indicator that there's a fundamental problem when proprietors and consumers are reclassifying a bag of pork rinds as a proper meal.
Exactly.
Although I would have always thought that was the case. But
This is Texas, so that's absolutely food.
So we'll put that into your measurements for next year too. But so let's pivot and actually talk about the rankings. And one of the reasons it's important to point out that this is 2018 data is that your number one forever has been Hong Kong.
Hong Kong's been number one every year for which we have data, which now goes back to the 50s. I think Hong Kong shows up in 70, but from a data point of view, they've always been number one. It's not even been a close call. I mean, I probably didn't need to do an economic freedom index to know it. I mean, they have a top tax rate of 15%. They have no tariffs, 0.0 tariffs. No inflation. I mean, it takes one day to start. I mean, every category pretty much Hong Kong is at or near the top of our economic freedom scores. So they average out to be number one. It's not. And Singapore is number two. But you're right. Our data are 2 years old. It takes more or less a year for whoever I get the data to get it, and a year for me to get it from them, and we have to publish. So we're always lagging. And the big question mark for us is what happens to Hong Kong next year. Here in a matter of a few months, I'll start collecting the data for 19. And the big protests and crackdown began more or less in the middle of 19. So internally, we're all kind of curious as to what's going to happen. But we just put the numbers in. If the numbers come back and say in 2019, Hong Kong was still number one, that's what we're going to publish. I suspect their numbers will get worse.
Yeah.
It's in that legal area and property rights area, and the security of the rule of law, all of that breaking down, and the reaction of the government to the crisis. But a lot of things won't change. It's not like they raised taxes. Tariff rates didn't change. The inflation rate hasn't gotten any worse. So most of the things that we measure for Hong Kong aren't going to be different. But that second area, that rule of law, property rights, that area will pick it up. I'm pretty sure. But at the end of the day, it's whatever the ratings are, or whatever they are.
My friend who runs Freedom House, we had a similar conversation with him on this show, and they rank essentially civil liberties.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure they say it that way. They talk about liberal democracy, but it's freedom of speech, freedom of association. Can you vote? Can women be in the workplace? And maybe that's more economic, and I know you guys look at that too, but you guys explicitly don't measure any of that stuff.
Yeah, in the index itself, we're silent on political rights, so voting, competitive elections, free and fair elections, all of that, and also civil liberties. We're silent on that. It's not because we don't care about those things. I care deeply about those things. I really, really enjoy my civil liberties. But one of the research questions that we're interested in, and from the very beginning though, was what is the kind of nexus? What's the connection between our economic liberties and our civil and political liberties?
Is there a correlation?
Is there a correlation, or how does that correlation work? A lot of ink's been spilled. Friedrich Hayek wrote a whole book, The Road to Serfdom, basically about this. Most of Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman was about this. So a lot of people have ideas about how political freedom, democracy, civil liberties like freedom of speech goes or doesn't go with like frankly more mundane freedoms like buying and selling stuff. That's the stuff I care about. But we didn't want to put that stuff in our index, even though we care about those things as well, because we wanted to separate them. And then once we're done with that, we can kind of, play the empirical games and say, hey, do countries that have more economic freedom, do they tend to be more democratic? Do they tend to have better freedom of speech? Or are women treated better or worse? These kinds of questions that are not normally considered economic questions. We wanted to know how the economics and the civil and political side played together or didn't play together.
And there appears to be a correlation.
Oh, it's correlation. It's very strong.
Yeah.
Most of the countries that score well on my index score highly on Freedom House's political rights, civil liberties indexes. There are some minor oddballs, and Hong Kong is one of them. Hong Kong is the most economically free, and they're far from the most politically free. They have something of a little election thing for a local parliament, but essentially, even under the British, there was a British governor who really ran things, and now the chief executive, with a lot of input from Beijing, is running things. So they don't really have an authentic liberal democracy.
Yeah,
and they had civil liberties of a pretty good order until very recently. But after dozens and dozens of journalists disappear, or get beat up, or lose their jobs, and newspapers, and after all the crackdown that we've seen, their civil liberties have also gone away. So Hong Kong's an oddball. Most countries are more like Sweden or like the United States. Like, we're pretty high on the economic freedom index, and we're pretty high on the political freedoms, civil liberties. We haven't completely lost those. And then at the other end, there's like places like Venezuela today where they're low on both. But there are these weird ones where you get a little bit of a disconnect, and those disconnects are
Singapore is a
interesting.
little weird too. Right?
Yeah, they're very weird.
And is that number 2 still?
They're number 2. So
Yeah.
Hong Kong and Singapore are 1 and 2 on our index, and neither one is a stellar example of a liberal democracy. I would have said Singapore was worse until recently.
Yeah.
Although I don't know that I'd say that today. A friend of ours, Chris Lingle, I'm sure he's a friend of yours, was kicked out of Singapore because he wrote an op-ed. So, I mean, that's not civil liberties, right? When you can write a op-ed.
Sounds like something you'd do, by the way.
Well, yeah. He's never been back as far as I know.
Yeah.
But most countries, there's a connection. So it correlates very well. I'm kind of interested in those oddballs. Like, ooh, you're a country that's just generally free or generally unfree isn't very interesting. A country that's free in one way but not free in another dimension, that's interesting. Like, how is that an equilibrium? Are you going to stay like that forever? Are there tensions? And I have to say, even though I've been looking at this for now all of my career, I'm not sure I know the answers. It's complicated. Milton Friedman wrote a line in his one book. It says, the relationship between political freedom is, complex and by no means unilateral. And he was right. It's not a simple story. The good news, though, is if you are worried about democracy, if you care about democracy, if you care about your civil liberties, you don't really need to worry about economic freedom upsetting them. The general correlation is positive.
But the opposite might also be true, that if you care about democracy and free speech and civil liberties and the right to marry whoever you want, economic freedom may be an important aspect to getting there.
Yeah, that other oddball combination. So Hong Kong is a combination with high economic freedom but not great political freedom, as is Singapore. The other oddball would be like democratic Venezuela. So Venezuela of 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Venezuela was a socialist country. They had nationalized the means of production. Not all of the means, but sufficiently large swaths of the Venezuelan economy were under direct ownership and control of the Venezuelan government. We would call that a socialist country. They called it socialist. But they were democratic. Chavez was elected democratically. I think Maduro's first election was maybe sort of not completely corrupt.
Yeah.
But what's happened over time, as the Venezuelan economy has tanked, because it's a socialist economy, the economy doesn't function well. People got upset with the government, and the government realized, oh my gosh, if we let people speak freely on the newspapers or in the televisions, and if we let them vote freely and fairly, we're going to lose. So what's happened, as you know, in the last decade, is the Venezuelan democracy has collapsed. There is no longer free and fair elections. Political parties have been shut down. Opposition leaders are arrested. Voters are literally told that if you don't vote for the ruling party, your ration card, which is how you are going to survive the next month, your food will get taken away. And so we don't have an authentic liberal democracy anymore. They did once, and I'm pretty sure that that combination, that oddball combination, is not sustainable. There's no country that has managed to control its economy at a high level, like a socialist level, that has maintained a democracy. Yeah. Most of them never even had it. The Soviets never even made a pretense of democracy. So they never even tried to have a democracy with their socialist economy. But to its credit, Venezuela tried to have socialism with democracy, but eventually they had to give up the democracy.
Are you saying that democratic socialism is unsustainable?
It's unsustainable.
Is that what you're suggesting?
It's not an equilibrium. It can't last. And the reason it can't last is because the economy will not perform.
Yeah.
And if economies don't perform, people vote the rascals out. Now, there are a couple other examples where they tried it and they went the other way. So I think Israel and India are both examples. India in the 70s, Israel in the 70s. I mean, Israel was founded primarily by socialists. The Zionist movement was a socialist movement. And so the Israeli economy from day one was a heavily government-controlled economy, and it was terrible. We used to laugh about it. I'm old enough to remember, we would joke about they had hyperinflation. It was like all of the, And so Israel was a socialist, they weren't like Soviet Union bad, but they were a socialist country. And the economy was terrible. People were emigrating out of Israel in the 70s and 80s. And then the government said, well, we've got to fix this. Now, one way to fix it is to do the Venezuela's thing and clamp down on civil liberties to maintain power. The other way is to liberalize the economy. And India did the same thing. India liberalized their economy. Israel liberalized their economy. So now, today, they more or less match. Like their economic freedom in Israel is pretty high. It's not like in Hong Kong, but it's pretty high. And their political freedoms are pretty high.
Where is Israel at ballpark? Is it like the second?
They're in that they're in the second quarter.
Yeah.
So I think they're rating wise around a 7, and they're let's call them 70th percentile. Upper middle.
Yeah.
Plenty of room for them to improve, but not a basket case,
right,
by any means. But they would. I mean, in the 70s, absolutely would have been a basket case. I mean, not Soviet Union or Mao's China bad, but absolutely, a 3 on a 10-point scale, a 4 on a 10-point scale, really bad. India the same way. So those countries also tried the democratic socialism thing, and they got rid of the socialism. Venezuela tried democratic socialism, and they got rid of the democracy. The point, though, is that I think democratic socialism is not a sustainable kind of combination. You got to get rid of one or the other. it's been a lot better for the countries that got rid of the socialism part. But
Yeah. And hopefully, without, I spent a lot of time trying to take this idea of democratic socialism seriously to see if there is something different in the mix, and I can't find it yet. And I think this data sort of supports my notion that you can't be democratic in the long term and be socialist.
I can imagine it on extraordinarily small scales. The Israeli kibbutz is a good example. A very, very small scale enterprise, numbers in hundreds of people. Maybe the largest kibbutzes were 1,000 people or something. And they ran those things democratically. They voted on everything, like what's going to be for dinner tonight. Like, can you imagine how horrible that would be? But anyway, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to live in these sort of voluntary, democratically run socialist places. But if you try to scale that beyond just a few people, it'll break down very quickly, and it always has. So I think very small scale democratic socialism, like my family's kind of a democratic socialist enterprise. We don't have prices on the refrigerator, and we don't take votes as much, but we collaboratively decide where we go for dinner, and it works. What kind of car we're going to buy. These are collaborative, joint, democratic-like decisions in my household. But it's only, my household's now only 2 people, but it's not that hard to do it. But you want to do it for 1 million people, 300 million people? You're not going to be able to have an authentic, functioning, democratic decision-making process that doesn't either horribly go wrong or again, you'll get a disconnect with the performance of the economy.
In my household, I'm Hong Kong, and my wife is communist China. So that's how things function there.
She's in charge.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. Probably in my household too. We like to fool ourselves, but.
Yeah, but she's convinced me that it's not true, that there's an equal and open democracy. Let's talk about, so Venezuela is the last on the list.
They're 162 out of 162. Little footnote is we don't rate Cuba or North Korea because we don't have data. World Trade Organization, World Bank, IMF, there's no data on North Korea or Cuba. And we're such a data-driven index that without the data, we don't rate them. I mean, they're last. I mean, North Korea should be last.
Yeah.
But among the countries we're able to rate, Venezuela is last. And they weren't always. I mean, back in the 70s when we had numbers for them, they were in the top quarter.
I feel like cannibalism should be one of your criteria for whether or not your country's free.
If you have to eat other people, I'm pretty sure that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
It might be more of an outcome variable, more of a result, but
I mean, it's a thing in North Korea for sure, and it's sort of like is one of the worst versions of socialism is where that has happened because of its fundamental inability to produce food to feed people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's even true in Venezuela. Yeah. The average Venezuelan's losing weight. I mean, they can't produce or import enough calories to sustain the population's weight.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are famously horrific stories, but they're eating their pets.
Yeah.
And I like to tell that story because I want people to understand in a very visceral way why economics matters, because I think most people don't think about supply and demand if they're even slightly normal.
Yeah.
You and I are not normal, so we do these things.
Right.
But these things matter in terms of things that we do care about. Talk about the relationship between health and wealth, because this is something that I think the lockdowners are ignoring when they think that any concern about economic consequences is sort of you don't care about human life.
Yeah, empirically, I mean, one of the rhetorics. Before COVID, you would hear this occasional complaint: "Oh, all you guys care about is money. You don't care about things other things like what about health? What about all you care about is GDP? Things like that." And well, here's the problem: GDP is the name we give to the stuff we have in our economy. That includes water treatment plants and sewers that get rid of our waste. That includes hospitals, the doctors that are and nurses in those hospitals, and MRI machines. GDP is just a name for all that stuff that does, in fact, make us healthier and live longer and makes the lives more comfortable while we're there. So GDP is just sort of a stand-in word that we have for stuff. Now, it could also be, trash. It could be pornography, something else, some other kind of thing that isn't very healthy, maybe for long lives. But but my point is, like, if you look at rich countries, people that have more GDP, they live longer, they're healthier, cancer rates are better, survival rates are better in every dimension. So there isn't really I agree that money isn't everything, but empirically, money and GDP and economic growth and those kinds of boring, mundane things that egghead economists like me like to talk about, they correlate really well with access to clean water, infant mortality, and all the other sort of so-called social measures. And that's for good reason. How do we keep infants from dying? We build better hospitals and staff them with better nurses and doctors and provide better machinery to, better incubators and all the other things we have. So that stuff that we call GDP is the stuff that we use to stay alive. So there really isn't a conflict. And sure enough, it turns out economically free countries have more stuff. Adam Smith was right. The wealth of the nation is in fact higher when you've got more liberty. And that means they also live longer, and infant mortality rates are lower, and just all the metrics. It's one of the challenges I sometimes give students when I talk to students about this. I say, go find me a variable. Go find me a variable. Go find me something in the World Bank. World Bank has literally thousands of data points, variables available. Go find me one good thing that correlates negatively with economic freedom, or vice versa. Find me a bad thing that correlates positively. And I've only found one. I actually have found one. It's obesity. If you look at national obesity rates, percentage of the population that's above, whatever the cutoff in BMI is, it turns out more economically free countries are more obese. And that's a real health problem. I mean, obesity is a real problem. But given that human beings have spent most of the many, many millennia on this planet trying to get enough food in our bodies to stay alive till tomorrow, the fact that we've reached the point where the problem is that we have too much food but we've solved all the other problems. Like infant mortality is now numbers like 1 per 1,000 births or something. It's really small numbers in most countries.
I'm going to blame, in our country, government corrupted nutritional advice on that, but that's the subject for a different subject, but for a different show. But I do have friends in India who often tell me that the ultimate status symbol in that country, where people on the streets are very skinny, is having a big old belly. Like that's a goal.
Yeah.
To be a little bit overweight, because then you know that you're not going to starve to death.
Well, that's true. And it was true in Europe and the United States in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Oh, he must be rich.
Yeah.
Because he's fat. He must be rich.
Yeah.
He must be productive. He's doing something right. When most people were, you've seen data on like World War II military conscripts, and just the horrific health that many Americans were in going into World War II. And three decades later, the problem is, oh my gosh, we have diabetes. Again, it's a real problem. I mean, obesity does carry with it serious health risks, but the fact that our relatively free economic system has generated so much wealth that we've not solved problems, that we've dramatically reduced so many health problems. We've increased one, and that's okay. I'll own that. That's the only one. I mean, out of the hundreds and hundreds of variables that I've been able to look at in the World Bank's database and all the other places, I've only found one sort of chart that goes the wrong way.
So like my friends in Honduras who struggle with real questions of hunger, they call this grumbling with a full belly.
Yeah.
And it gives you some perspective. It is a real problem. And I think the government has some culpability in creating it. One final question, and then I want to spend a little bit of time. We're running out of time, but I want to talk about the Bridwell Center and how people can actually engage with you and your stuff. But our friend, I think Anthony Davies, he posted something on Twitter a couple days ago pointing out that the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the cost of COVID and lockdowns will be $15 trillion. And that's a big number. He tried to translate it for people. It's an inconceivably big number to me. And he said, we could buy Spain for that much money. What is the impact of the United States spending $15 trillion it doesn't have on COVID and lockdowns?
From the Economic Freedom Index point of view, it has to be bad. I mean, direct spending by the government is captured in our index, and that's gone up like crazy. Some things will not. I mean, if
and by the way, that may not be just government spending. It may be like the net economic loss to.
Right. So my university, SMU, spent millions and millions of dollars. And our index is not going to capture that. And probably it shouldn't. I mean, some of that spending was legit, whatever. But the mandated government, like tax-based spending, that's going to be in there. I mentioned the variable on the travel visas. That's going to get hit. I do worry that our index, which is a global index dealing with 162 countries, the sort of finer points of COVID, like shutting down bars and restaurants, that lockdown type policy, that's not in my index, and I don't know exactly how it's going to get captured. So I think there will be a negative consequence in our index, but I also think we may not fully capture it with the data we have. It's not like the tariff rate changed. The income tax rates haven't changed. So the breakdown in the rule of law part that we talked about a little bit earlier, that should show up. How much it shows up, for me, it's going to be. I can't wait really for a year. It's going to be 2 years before I know, though.
Yeah. Let's talk about. So where can people find the index? It's a very readable and consumable product.
Yeah. So the index. Well, I'd never heard that actually, Matt. I mean, the book is primarily
maybe I'm a geek.
162 pages of numbers. It's really not very readable. There's a front chapter that's readable, but most of the book is just tables and tables of numbers. I mean, if you want to know what Senegal's top marginal tax rate is, it's in the book.
I used to be a budget economist that had to read CBO data, so maybe
right.
I'm exposing
You probably think this is really fascinating.
Yeah.
But if you just Google Economic Freedom of the World, that is our brand title, EFW, Economic Freedom of the World. But and Fraser Institute in Canada is our publisher, but 2 of the 4 principal authors, myself and another guy, Ryan Murphy, are at SMU, where I work. And we're in this Bridwell Institute, which is a center there. And so if you go Bridwell Institute or Economic Freedom SMU, you certainly will find.
So you're right here in the Dallas area. Talk about the priorities other than this index for the Bridwell Center.
Yeah. So what we
Institute.
And this is very important because institutes cost more. So Mr. Tucker Bridwell gave us a lot of money, and he didn't give us center money. He gave us institute money. And in the university world, that's important.
Which is why you insist on being called doctor.
That's precisely right.
When you're running a center, I
was a center director, until a few months ago. Now I'm a institute director. It's much better.
Yeah.
This is the silliness of university pecking orders, but it does matter in my world. So we're primarily a research shop. We do the Economic Freedom Index. We also do a state level Economic Freedom Index called Economic Freedom of North America. With the main person on that is Dean Stanzel, and he works with another person, Meg Tuzinski. She's in our office. So we're kind of an economic freedom research shop. That's what we do. But if you're in the Dallas area, we do a lot of public-facing programs. We do, normally we do big public lectures, debates, panels, 2 or 3 per semester. And usually we do a big annual conference, which is people invited from the public to attend. Right now, everything's kind of online, which is, it is what it is. But if anyone's out there from DFW, it's pretty easy to shoot us an email, get on our mailing list, and we really do. One of the things, aside from hard research, one of the things I want the Bridwell Institute to be is kind of a hub for discussions about free markets and capitalism and democracy, all these kind of big ideas, be a hub for that discussion in the DFW area. So when people think about capitalism and freedom and all this kind of stuff, they think of the Bridwell Institute in Dallas. Yeah. And hopefully give me money too, because I'm an institute, and Mr. Bridwell didn't give us all the money we need to operate. We are.
So how do we send you checks?
Oh, there's a link on the website. They take visas.
Do you know the URL?
Of course not.
Of course not. Just Google it.
Yeah, that's right.
So, like, I have to apologize. Unlike the last time you were in the Blaze TV studio, you were slamming beers with Stu.
Totally sober.
Yeah.
Actually, the time before that, I was with you, and we got pretty lit too. So
Yeah. Well, it was an empirical question about the quality of beer in North Korea, which turns out to be wanting. Let's just say that. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Bye. That was amazing. Where can I get more content just like that? It's a great question. You're clearly a discerning consumer of the best content. Make sure to like the video, subscribe, and click the bell. And if you're consuming podcasts, go to Apple, Stitcher, anywhere you get them. I'm in. Kibbe on Liberty, honest conversations with interesting people.